The United States right now is blackmailing Ukraine into accepting a 28-point plan that they developed alongside Russia. And I just got my hands on it today. I got the version of it that's in Ukrainian. I translated it, and I wanted to sit down with you and break it down. But before we do, we are now hearing from Zelensky and from Putin. Zelensky uploaded about a 10-minute long video on his Telegram channel, which was then later put online. And in it, he said a lot of different things, and just to kind of summarize it, he pretty much said that while Ukraine, of course, is always open to many diplomatic means to ending this war, they're not being blackmailed into it. Like Zelensky says right here, Ukraine may be soon facing an extremely difficult choice, either the loss of dignity or the risk of losing a key partner. Either 28 complicated points or the hardest winter yet, and the risks that follow. We didn't even know about this plan up until a few days ago when the report came out from Axios. And in that, they didn't list every little thing in it. Some called it a compromise. Some said it was pretty much Ukraine just surrendering. And some also said it looks like the United States is telling Ukraine, it's your time to be punished for Russia's invasion, and you should have given up on February 24th. And so we're so confused about this. So I had reached out to my friends who work in different media rooms and newsrooms in Ukraine, who said they had a copy of it. I got it, and I translated it. And I want you to do a few different things. I want you, if you got time today, to sit down and watch Zelensky's video. They were smart about this because when they recorded it, obviously Zelensky's speaking in Ukrainian, but they made sure to put English subtitles on it. So that way, no information gets misunderstood. That way, no information gets translated into a way that maybe doesn't make sense or makes Ukraine look really bad. But really, I think Zelensky wanted to send a message to the United States that, like, you're not going to coerce us into signing something which essentially gives up everything that we've been working for. You know, remember that we were a country that was attacked. We were a country that was sovereign, independent, minding our own business when our neighbor decided to physically come in, attack our country, kill our civilians, and still commit war crimes every single day. And so in Zelensky's speech, he talks about unity. He talks about how, Ukrainians, we need to all come together because, if we don't accept what the United States is saying, they're going to blackmail us. And you're probably saying, blackmail? What on earth would he be talking about? Well, a new report from Reuters came out today in which the United States is blackmailing Ukraine by saying, you have until next Thursday, that is November 27th, that is the US Thanksgiving, to say yes to this plan, or we're going to do two things. We're going to start cutting back supplies that are going to Ukraine, more than likely referring to the equipment that NATO is purchasing for Ukraine, because at this very moment, the United States is not giving Ukraine anything for free. The US is all about making money on this war, and so they would stop selling things to NATO and to Ukraine. And also, the United States would then stop sharing intelligence. That's right. When I say that the United States is blackmailing Ukraine, 100%, the United States, under Donald Trump, is blackmailing Ukraine. Here's the deal. Once again, up to this point, we had only heard from, this report from Axios and Reuters and from Zelensky. But now we're hearing from Putin, who just yesterday, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry said that we never got anything. We don't know what thing you're talking about. Turns out that was a lie. And that's actually coming from Putin himself. Because now in a new interview that Putin had put online not too long ago, he says a few different things. Okay? He says that Russia has received the 28-point plan, even though this was something that Russia already knew they were working on. It wasn't like they didn't know this was a possibility. This is something they sent representatives down to Miami to meet with Steve Witkoff to address, to go over with. And there are a couple points that he kind of made in here. First is he claims that Russia had to make a ton of concessions in this plan. There are things that Russia had to give up in order for them to even be okay with said plan. He says a couple other things. He says here that Trump's peace plan for resolving the situation in Ukraine was discussed before the meeting in Alaska. So this plan is the original plan that Donald Trump had already worked out with Russia prior to the collapse of the meeting in Alaska. Yes, which means there had been nothing that really had changed since then in terms of this plan. He's just shoving the same thing back on Ukraine. He says that the U.S. had asked Russia to show some flexibility in resolving the Ukraine issue, which is once again, no, it's your invasion of Ukraine. If Ukraine stops fighting today, you keep going and take the whole country over. If Russia stops, the war's over. He then said that this plan had changed a bit. It was modernized after the Alaskan talks. He then says all of Russia's partners expressed support for possible agreements ahead of the Alaska summit, meaning that they already presented this to North Korea, Iran, China, and a couple other places, and they all said, yep, this all looks good. And then lastly, Putin says that the U.S. so far has failed to secure Ukraine's consent to the peace plan. Now, based upon what Putin has just said here, he makes it seem like that prior to the Alaskan meeting, okay, this plan was put together. This plan was then distributed to Ukraine and to Russia's partners. And said that said partners, okay, they said this was fine. And then from there, obviously the Alaskan meeting fell apart. Do you remember that weird little timing in which Zelensky was coming over and then everyone in Europe came over? I think everyone kind of knew about this plan and it had been worked up for quite some time. And it's only now that it got leaked. And remember, it only got leaked. All this was supposed to be very secretive. And we know this because of Steve Witkoff, the guy who actually worked on it, because only 3 people worked on this. Marco Rubio, Steve Witkoff, and then the Russian representative, Kirill. And when it was leaked, Steve Witkoff wrote on Twitter that pretty much I guess Kay leaked it, essentially is what he says. And we don't know who Kay is yet. We know it's not Keith Kellogg because there's no way for him to really know. And Keith Kellogg is also on his way out, which is horrible for Ukraine because he was the only positive voice for Ukraine inside the White House. This now all brings us to our point of, well, what is in this 28-point plan? And it's a lot. And before we dive into it, I just want to say one little note. When it comes to it, Russia's saying they made concessions here. But when you really start digging down into this whole report, when you start going through what's behind all of this, I want you to think of it as money. From day one, Steve Witkoff has been going to Russia almost every month, it felt like, and meeting with a lot of Russia's development and finance bros. Not there to talk about the end of the war, but to talk about what happens after the war ends. Steve Witkoff had been touring places inside of Russia of hey, when the war's over, you guys can open this or open that and flood our market and make a lot of money. And so I want you to keep that in mind as I'm reading this 28-point plan to you, because the whole time that I'm reading it, the thing that I say is, well, it just looks like the U.S. is just trying to end this war as fast as possible so they can make a shit ton of money. And yes, I cursed there. I'm sorry. And so let's do it. As I said before, I have the entire 28 points translated now. It's a lot. And so if you're joining us here on YouTube, do make sure you are actually subscribed. And make sure you share our videos as I bring you guys a lot of news and content. If you're with us on TikTok, because we are live at the same time, do make sure you are actually following me. And make sure you share our videos and you go back and you comment on our videos to make that reach get longer. So let's break it down. I will tell you, even though it is 28 points, there are subsections, and this is 4 pages. So if you're with us, it's going to be a little while to get through it all. And I'll add some context here and there. Some of it, there was one part that I didn't understand as much, but Let's break it down. And number-wise, you'll understand where it goes numbers, then letters. So 1. The sovereignty of Ukraine will be upheld. 2. Between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe, a full and all-encompassing agreement on peace will be concluded. Any unresolved issues over the past 30 years will be considered settled. Meaning that any issues that any country had with Russia within the past 30 years, when this is signed, forget about it. It never exists. It's done. Yeah, that's a red flag. That's a red flag, especially because Russia continues to do war crimes every single day inside of Ukraine. If you sign this, you cannot prosecute. That's what this is saying. Number 3, it is expected that Russia will not invade neighboring countries and NATO will not expand further. Which makes you ask, well, there's other countries that want to join that's not Ukraine, so they can't anymore, even if there's a pending application? That's what this seems like here. Number 4. A direct dialogue between Russia and NATO will be conducted, with U.S. mediation to resolve all security issues and create conditions for de-escalation, global security, and greater opportunities for mutual aid and maximum economic development. Which, that's not usually, the U.S. doesn't, while the U.S. is NATO, you can kind of say, NATO works as a whole. So why would the U.S. be in charge of making that decision when it should be all the NATO countries together? You're starting to see red flags, right? You're seeing some of the red flags in this. And we're only at point 4. 5, Ukraine will receive new security guarantees. Doesn't mention what said security guarantees would be. Just security guarantees. The size of the armed forces of Ukraine would be limited to 500,000 personnel. Now, I have seen different reports. ABC News listed it as 600. I saw another one that said 700, but this one says 500. So 500,000 in army. That's it, military. Doesn't make any sense. It seems like Russia wants Ukraine weakened so they could just invade further. Next, Ukraine will agree to amend its constitution, including a clause that will not allow Ukraine to join NATO. And NATO will also confirm it in its founding documents that Ukraine will not be accepted into the alliance at all. Like Ukraine will never, 20, 50, 1,000 years from now, which I will say that right there is actually something that would never work because NATO would actually, you would have to have the US Congress approve that. Then every country in NATO would have to approve that, and that's never going to happen. Number 8, European peacekeeping forces will be stationed in Poland. Not Ukraine. Not the thing that everyone said would be something. No, in Poland, which that's not really a force because right now Ukraine is the, I guess you can call it nuclear umbrella, shielding Europe and the United States from Russia. So that would just make Ukraine a giant buffer zone. All right. Number 9, this is at least something positive for Ukraine. Ukraine can join the EU, even though they've been working on that prior to Russia's invasion, prior to everything happening. I remember going back to Ukraine in 2016, and in 2016, Ukraine had already been doing all the requirements, fixing up roads, making things more what they need to be in order to be closer to the EU. Under Poroshenko, all of them. So that doesn't really make much sense that was always going to be a given. Even if this war ended and Ukraine lost half of its country, Ukraine was always going to be joining the EU. Next, the U.S. will provide compensation for the guarantee, which I don't understand that one, guarantee for Ukraine to join the EU. So they would pay all the fees associated with Ukraine joining the EU, which Ukraine already paid more than half of them. The U.S., this is a subsection, by the way, A and B. The U.S. will allocate $150 billion for the restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty. I mean, once again, what? $150 billion is nothing. Russia should be paying the money for destroying Ukraine, not the United States. Letter C. If Russia invades again, a previously prepared joint military force will intervene to defend Ukraine. Ukraine will have the right to join this military alliance. So, sort of like a Article 5 NATO response, but not but Ukraine can't be a part of NATO. Make that make sense? Now, D doesn't make any sense to me. It mentions the capital of Russia will be moved from Moscow to either St. Petersburg or other cities. I don't understand that one, but kind of is what it is. 10. Crimea will be granted a special autonomous free economic trade zone status with the right to trade with both Ukraine and Russia. So, essentially saying that they can trade either or, which, I mean, any country should be able to do that, right? Crimea is, though, Ukrainian. So I don't see what I mean there? It's kind of strange. Then it says here that investments in Crimea's infrastructure must be jointly guaranteed as not to harm Ukraine. Okay, that's sort of like a positive thing, but how do you do that when Russia had imported hundreds of thousands of people into Crimea in order to have those fake votes and referendums, etc.? Then we have 11. The development and expansion of Ukraine's economy will have the following directions. A. Creation of a development fund for investment in high-growth industries, including technology, data processing centers, and artificial intelligence. Okay. The United States will cooperate, this is B, with Ukraine on joint restoration, development, modernization, and Operation Ukraine's gas infrastructure, including transit pipelines and storage, which kind of seems like the U.S. wants to take over Ukraine's gas. That's what it seems like there. C, joint participation in restoration territories affected by the war, rebuilding, constructing, and modernizing cities and housing areas. Once again, it makes it seem like the United States wants to be on the ground level and essentially make money after rebuilding Ukraine. D, infrastructure development. Okay. Then it says here, in F, a global bank will develop a special financing package to accelerate these processes. So, finance. So it looks like loans. The U.S. is going to put together its own development in which they can loan Ukraine the money and then make the money off the interest. Once again, this is all about money. Then we have 12. Russia will be reintegrated into the global economy. This is something, if you read, seems like it's almost an instant thing. This is broken down into A through F. A. The lifting of sanctions will be discussed and implemented gradually and selectively. So sanctions would get off of Russia. B. The U.S. will withdraw U.S. long-term energy sanctions imposed. This will increase Russia's ability to produce and export resources, while the U.S. increases its influence on technological development, cyber defense, regulation of Arctic metals and minerals, as well as control over funds directed to the development of the Arctic region. So it seems like the U.S. is trying to get raw minerals out of Russia on that one. All about money, remember. C, Russia will be prohibited from producing over 20 gigatons. Doesn't say what, though. D, frozen assets of Russia will be used to restore more than 1,000 kilometers of Ukraine's destroyed residential areas, including using the existing industrial complex in Russia. So Russia will help pay for some of the things, and Russia will lose all the frozen assets, which I think is over $300 billion. So the $150 billion provided by the U.S. plus the $300 billion from Russia, and then Russia would help pay for some things. So maybe that's one little concession that Putin was talking about, that he would have to pay and be punished for something that he did here, right? It says here that Russia will prepare its own industrial zones up to 300 kilometers from Moscow to establish centers for creating the blocks and panels necessary for rebuilding cities. Russia will fulfill orders based upon UN humanitarian programs. So, at least there's one thing here, that Russia needs to build Ukraine. Not really sure the legality of that, but that's the only concession we've seen so far that Russia has made, except for, them not pushing further. Then E, the international community will be ensuring the implementation of these obligations. The joint work would be regulated by those countries whose national interests include the restoration and proper functioning of a stable and safe global community. I don't know what the hell that means. It could mean any country. F, a special American-European Development Committee will be created to ensure that all aspects of this agreement are actually implemented. And now we start getting back into numbers. That was only just all of 12. But they're kind of broken down a little bit more there. So that's 12. We'll just count that as 12, 13, 14, and 15 altogether. 16. Russia will legally end its policy of pressure on Europe and Ukraine. Not sure how that's happening since it's been going on since the Cold War. 17. The US and Russia will agree on a treaty on the non-deployment of nuclear weapons and control over them, including a New START treaty, something that, doesn't really even exist today. 18. Ukraine will agree to become a nuclear-free state under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, remember, Ukraine hasn't had nukes in the 90s because, well, we made an agreement that the United States would protect us, which we did not, and then ultimately the U.S. gave the nukes to Russia. Yeah. 19. A joint commission of energy companies will be established to inspect all nuclear facilities in Russia and Ukraine and jointly monitor them, which doesn't make any sense. We have the IAEA already. They already do that. It's the UN nuclear watchdog. So we need yet again another one. All right. 20. An agreement will be reached on joint inspections of biological laboratories to create transparency in their operation. Again, with Russia claiming that Ukraine has been working on biolabs, which was never confirmed. Russia just loves saying it. 21. A joint commission will work to organize the exchange of detainees and prisoners of war, which, yes, makes sense. It'll be made up of different representatives from the Red Cross and UN structures. And then, of course, journalists in the media will be allowed to be involved in all of this so that everything's transparent. Yes, we need everyone return. 22. Russia and Ukraine will make agreements, trade agreements. A joint commission will address issues of medical assistance and cooperation in medical technologies. Sanctions in the medical and humanitarian fields will not apply and will be lifted. Now we get into territories. Territories makes up 23-24. There's a lot here, okay? And let's try to break it down as fast as possible. Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk will be recognized as de facto Russian, and in that sense are subject to Russia. Something that is not going to happen. Let me tell you that right now. That's not going to happen. It's in the Ukrainian constitution, and Russia even knows that Ukraine would not change their constitution. Number 2 in this one, Kherson and Zaporizhia will be recognized as special zones with dual law and administration. Military presence will be at a minimum. Doesn't make any sense. The Zaporizhia nuclear power plant will be taken under international control and placed under a special regime for energy distribution amongst all parties. So the Ukrainian nuclear power plant will be then held by an international community and then be split down the middle for Ukraine and Russia. Make that make sense, since it is Ukrainian. Ukraine will receive full access to the Sea of Azov for commercial use of its territorial waters. Now, how would that happen if Russia takes over Luhansk and Donetsk? Make that make sense, especially if Russia at this point would control Crimea. It doesn't make any sense. That's what I'm trying to point out there. Ukraine will not restrict the movement of its citizens from these territories. Fixed checkpoints will operate. Not really sure what that means. Because Ukrainians from those territories, but the Russians have been going through and stealing Ukrainian passports and giving them Russian ones. There's a lot of gray area in that. You could tell that Russia is writing these things here. Next, residents will decide asylum and citizenship issues through a neutral, free, and independent administration. It almost seems like they're trying to build up that territory as though it's its own country, but then also say it's Russian. Ukraine will restore its economy by using reconstruction programs. Russia will return all confiscated property and business assets of Ukraine on its previously controlled territories. Now, I don't understand that. So let me back up for a second here. Let's say I owned a house in Bakhmut, or Divka, or Mariupol. Two of those three cities are completely destroyed down to just scorched earth. How would I then go back and get said property? How would that work? Because as far as I know, that property is gone. And Russia did it. And I'm not going to get anything for it. So is Russia going to pay people? Is Russia going to build new things for Ukrainians in those cities? Even though those are de facto Russian? It doesn't make sense. Next, Russia will not obstruct Ukraine's use of the Dnieper River for commercial activity. Well, yeah, because it's a Ukrainian river. Why would Russia restrict that? And even if you freeze and give Russia what they claim is theirs, why would Ukraine not be able to use their own river? And then lastly, a permanent humanitarian committee will operate on the following issues. Now, this actually breaks down into 24. All missing persons and bodies will be found and identified, which is hard. Coming from someone who lost people, and you have to identify what those bones look like 3 years later, it's virtually impossible. Experience, as someone who has to have dealt with these things, or family members who have had to dealt with these things, some of these Ukrainian bodies had been dumped into mass graves, unearthed, moved and dumped into more mass graves before then finally taken out of the ground and put into a giant room in which they're trying to put these bodies back together. So how's that going to work? That's what I want to know. Especially because Russia does not handle these bodies of soldiers in any humanitarian way at all. Then it says here there needs to be a reunification of families, which makes me wonder, does that mean that families that had to run away because of Russia's invasion, would they have to go back? Like, let's say they went to Europe or the United States, would they be forced to go back? Are we only talking about the thousands of Ukrainian children that Russia stole and abducted? Will these kids even know who their parents are? Because Russia's done this so long ago that some of these kids were like 2. And now, think about this for a second here. 4 years of war. That means they're 6. Do you think they even remember their parents? Right? Then, this is where things get interesting. This is getting back into the numbers. Ukraine must conduct an election within 100 days of signing said agreement. Which, if you know how the Ukrainian constitution works, it's only parliament who can decide when an election can take place. They would only make said decision once they feel their country is safe. Signing this is not feeling safe, just so that we all understand. And to say that if we sign it today, it's 100 days from today, doesn't make any sense, since an agreement this complex could take several months to even initiate. Now, the last ones are 26, 27, and 28, okay? For families disadvantaged by the conflict, Ukraine will receive a special amnesty for the purpose of assistance, submission of claims, and settlement of disputes in national and international courts. Now, this is such a major gray area because there's so many different levels. I've got families whose houses were completely destroyed. I've got families whose children were murdered by Russians. I've got some friends who complete complexes that they lived in are gone. This is such a major thing, and who's going to pay for this? Russia needs to pay for this. And what puts value on someone's life? What puts value on a house? What puts value on your house being destroyed, your husband being murdered, and then you having to fly over to a different country to live? What is the monetary value in that Russia should be paying? There's not an answer to that. I just want you to know that. There's not an answer to that. Because it's hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of damage, emotionally and physically, that Russia has done. Enough that should bankrupt Russia. Next, this treaty would be unlimited. It would be monitored by a guarantor. the UN Peace Council with participation from the US, Israel, right? And any violations will be recorded. I'm not sure why they're involving Israel here. That doesn't make any sense to me. And then lastly, after the treaty are signed, all military action will stop and troops will be withdrawn from key positions within 48 hours before the start of the agreement's actual beginning. Yeah. This is what the United States is trying to force Ukraine into signing. Now you understand why Zelensky said no. He didn't really actually say no. He said that we're always appreciative of Donald Trump trying to stop this war, and they're always open to negotiations, but not a hey, you're taking this, or we're going to guarantee that Russia just takes the entirety of you. In an agreement that was made well before Donald Trump changed his mind. I'm not even sure Donald Trump even knows about this agreement, since it was so secretive, and we weren't supposed to know about this at all. But thanks to some great reporters, Axios, Reuters, you name it, even Politico had information tied to all of this. This is out there so that you, the public, can have your own opinion. So that you can make noise. So that you can get fucking angry and call your representative and say, do not let America do this shit to Ukraine. Because at the end of the day, Donald Trump only cares about money. He only cares about ending this war so that they can start cooperation with Russia, so they can start making money with Russia, and they don't give a shit about Ukraine. And that's the upsetting part. That's the America, unfortunately, that we're living in at this time. Because this agreement, this blackmail that the US is trying to put Ukraine into is exactly that, blackmail. But if there is public outrage, if there are people calling their representative, if there are people out there like you picking up the phone and telling their representative, Ukraine, this is not fair to them. You are rewarding Russia, and that's not okay. If there are people angry and showing protest and letting their voices be heard, then guess what? The US will have to fold and walk this back. And so what are you doing right now? Call your representative. Whether you're in the United States, whether you're in Europe, doesn't matter what the country is. Put pressure on your politicians so that the right thing is done here. Russia claims there's concessions. Russia claims they had to give a lot up. They did not. They invaded a peaceful country, slaughtered civilians, a crazy amount of war crimes we can't even count anymore. And they should be punished for what they've done in Ukraine. I will, of course, keep you guys updated on all of this. So please do share my videos, as it's more important more now than ever that Ukraine has a voice and you can be Ukraine's voice.